After my husband died, my son promised he would take care of me. 3 months later, he sold my house and put me in a nursing home. The day he dropped me off, he laughed and said nobody wanted an old woman living alone. I said nothing, because he didn't know what his father had left behind. Before I continue, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this deserve to be heard. My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 74 years old, and until recently, I believed the hardest part of my life was losing my husband. I was wrong. The hardest part came 3 months later, when my own son decided I was no longer useful to him. My husband, Richard Hale, died quietly on a cool autumn morning. 46 years of marriage ended in the span of a few shallow breaths while sunlight crept across the bedroom curtains. He had been sick for months, but the final moment still felt unreal, like someone had suddenly erased half the world. The house felt enormous after that. Too quiet, too still. Richard had built that house himself in 1981 on Willow Street. He used to joke that every nail carried a little piece of his stubbornness. The floors creaked in familiar places, the kitchen window looked out over the garden he planted, and the porch swing moved gently whenever the wind passed through the maple tree in the yard. That house wasn't just a building, it was our life. For the first few weeks after the funeral, my son Daniel visited often. He brought groceries, helped fix a leaky pipe under the sink, and insisted on mowing the lawn every Saturday. "You shouldn't worry about things like this anymore, Mom," he said. I remember feeling grateful. Grief makes you vulnerable. It makes you hold tightly to the people who remain. And Daniel was all I had left. He was 43 years old, confident and successful. After Richard retired, Daniel had taken over Hale Construction, the small contracting business my husband started decades earlier. Under Daniel's management, the company had grown faster than Richard ever imagined. At least that's what Daniel liked to tell people. At the time I believed him. The changes started slowly. Daniel began asking questions about the house. At first they seemed harmless. "Mom, have you ever thought about moving somewhere smaller? You know, this place is a lot of work for one person. Those stairs could become dangerous." Each comment sounded reasonable, concerned, loving. But there was something beneath the words that I couldn't quite identify. A quiet impatience. One afternoon, he came over carrying several documents in a thin leather folder. "Just a few updates," he said casually. "Insurance paperwork, nothing complicated." I signed them without reading carefully. After all, he was my son. That was my second mistake. A few weeks passed, and Daniel's visits became shorter. He stopped staying for dinner. Stopped asking how I was sleeping. Stopped talking about his father. Instead, he seemed focused on numbers, costs, maintenance, property values. Then one Tuesday morning he arrived unexpectedly. He stood in the kitchen holding another folder, the same confident expression on his face. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk." The tone of his voice immediately made my stomach tighten. I set my coffee cup down slowly. "What about?" Daniel didn't sit. Instead, he walked around the kitchen as if inspecting it. His eyes moved across the cabinets, the table, the windows, the way someone might look at a house they were about to sell. "The place is getting old," he said. "Repairs are expensive. The roof will need work soon." I watched him carefully. "That may be true," I replied. "But the house has stood for 40 years. He opened the folder. Inside were documents. Real estate documents. And suddenly I understood. Daniel slid one sheet across the table. "Mom," he said calmly, "I've already taken care of everything." I looked down. The words blurred for a moment before they made sense. Property transfer agreement. Willow Street residence. Sold. 2 days earlier. For a long time I didn't speak. I simply stared at the paper while the clock on the wall ticked quietly behind us. Then I looked up. "Daniel," I said slowly, "why does this say our house has been sold?" He exhaled as if preparing for a difficult conversation. "You signed the authorization last month." "No," I said immediately. "You must have forgotten." "I forget many things these days," I replied calmly. "But I would remember selling my home." For the first time, Daniel's expression hardened slightly. "Mom," he said, "let's not turn this into a fight." "A fight? The house was too much for you." And who decided that? He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled another sheet from the folder and placed it in front of me. It wasn't a legal document. It was a brochure. Green Meadows Senior Living. A photograph showed elderly residents smiling in a bright garden. "You're sending me to a nursing home," I said quietly. "Assisted living," Daniel corrected. "I'm perfectly capable of living in my own house." He leaned against the counter. "Not anymore." The finality in his voice told me something important. This wasn't a conversation. It was an announcement. "I'm not moving," I said. Daniel looked at me with mild irritation. "Yes," he replied. "You are." 3 days later, I woke up in a small beige room with a rattling heater and unfamiliar walls. Green Meadows Senior Living. Daniel carried my suitcase inside and placed it near the bed. He didn't stay long. "Try to make friends," he said lightly. Then he paused at the door and chuckled. "You know, nobody wants an old woman living alone anyway." And just like that he walked out. For the first week I barely spoke to anyone. I sat in the garden, watched the nurses come and go, and listened to the quiet conversations of people who had been left here by families that promised to visit more often than they actually did. Time moves strangely in places like that. Days blend. But something inside me refused to accept that this was the end of my story. Then, one gray afternoon, a man I had never seen before approached my table in the garden. He wore a dark suit and carried a leather briefcase. "Mrs. Margaret Hale?" he asked politely. "Yes. My name is Victor Langford." He handed me a business card. "Langford and Associates. Corporate Law." I looked at him with quiet curiosity. "And what can I do for you, Mr. Langford?" He sat down across from me. "Well," he said carefully, "I'm here because of your husband." My chest tightened slightly. "My husband passed away." "Yes," he said gently. "I'm aware." He opened his briefcase and removed a thin folder. Then he said something that made the air around us feel suddenly heavier. "Mrs. Hale, your son believes he owns Hale Construction." I frowned. "Of course he does. Daniel runs the company." Victor shook his head slowly. "That's true. But legally, he doesn't own it." My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Victor placed a document on the table. I looked down. My name was printed clearly across the top. Majority shareholder. Margaret Hale. Owner of 60% of Hale Construction. I stared at the paper in disbelief. "That can't be right." Victor met my eyes calmly. "Your husband transferred the controlling shares to you before he died." The garden suddenly felt very quiet. Daniel thought he owned the company. He thought he controlled everything Richard had built. But the truth was something entirely different. And Victor Langford wasn't finished speaking. "Mrs. Hale," he said carefully, "there's something else you need to know." "What is it?" He closed the folder slowly. "Your son is planning to sell the company." He paused. "And if that deal goes through, you'll lose the only thing he never realized belonged to you." That evening I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because, for the first time since my son left me in that nursing home room, something finally made sense. Daniel had always been confident. Too confident. He walked through life as if every door would open simply because he expected it to. But confidence built on a lie is fragile. And now I knew something Daniel did not. I owned 60% of Hale Construction. The company he believed belonged entirely to him. Victor Langford watched my reaction carefully as I read the document again. The paper trembled slightly in my hands. Not from fear. From the weight of what it meant. "Are you certain this is correct?" I asked quietly. Victor nodded. "The documents were signed by your husband 8 years ago." 8 years? Yes. That meant Richard had made the decision long before his illness became serious. Long before the hospital visits. Long before the quiet mornings when we both pretended everything would somehow return to normal. He had planned this. But he had never told me. Why would he keep something like this secret? I asked. Victor closed his briefcase slowly. "I believe your husband had concerns." "About what?" He hesitated. "About your son." Those words hung in the air between us. And suddenly memories began surfacing in my mind. Small moments. Little arguments between Richard and Daniel that never seemed important at the time. Disagreements about money, about expansion, about risk. Richard had always believed in slow growth, careful work, honest contracts. Daniel believed in speed, profit, opportunity. At the time, I assumed it was simply a difference between generations. But now, I wasn't so sure. Does Daniel know about these shares? I asked. Victor shook his head. No. How is that possible? He runs the company. He runs the company, Victor said calmly. But ownership and management are two very different things. I looked down at the document again. My name stared back at me in black ink. For 60 seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Victor added something that made my stomach tighten. There's another reason I came to see you today. What reason? Your son is finalizing negotiations to sell Hale Construction. The words hit me like cold water. Sell it? Yes. To whom? A development group based in Seattle. The deal is scheduled to close in less than 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Daniel had sold my house, moved me into a nursing home, and now he was about to sell the company my husband built. The same company that legally belonged to me. Why hasn't anyone stopped him? I asked. Victor leaned forward slightly. Because the buyers believe he owns the company. And he doesn't. No. Victor paused. But unless someone challenges the sale before the contracts are finalized, the deal could still go through. I felt the familiar calm that sometimes arrives in moments of crisis. The calm that allows you to think clearly when everyone else is rushing. What happens if the sale goes through? I asked. Victor answered quietly. Then the company would legally transfer to the buyers. And your majority shares would be caught in a very complicated legal dispute. In other words, I said slowly, Daniel would walk away with millions. Victor didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence told me enough. For the first time since arriving at Green Meadows, I stood up from the garden chair. I'd like to see the rest of those documents, I said. Victor opened the folder again. Inside were copies of contracts, share certificates, legal filings. Each page confirmed the same thing. Richard Hale had transferred controlling ownership of Hale Construction to me years earlier, and Daniel had either never noticed or never bothered to check, which raised an important question. Was my son careless? Or was he hiding something? That night I didn't sleep much. The nursing home room felt smaller than usual. The heater rattled softly against the wall while moonlight filtered through the thin curtains. For weeks, I had felt powerless, trapped. But now the situation looked very different. Daniel believed I was weak, confused, easy to ignore. That mistake would soon become very expensive. The next morning, Victor returned with more information. Mrs. Hale, he said, there's something you should see. He placed a tablet computer on the small table beside my bed. The screen displayed financial reports, company records, email correspondence. Where did you get this? I asked. I have access to certain corporate filings. I began reading. Within minutes, something strange caught my attention. Numbers that didn't match. Transactions that seemed unusually large. What is this account? I asked. Victor leaned closer. That, he said carefully, is the company's emergency capital reserve. Richard had always insisted on maintaining one. A safety net in case of economic downturns. I remembered the arguments clearly. Daniel thought the reserve was unnecessary. Richard refused to remove it. How much is in it? I asked. Victor hesitated before answering. $22 million. I blinked. 22 million? Yes. The number was almost absurd. Richard had built that reserve slowly over decades. Contract by contract. Project by project. And Daniel had kept it intact. Which meant he was planning something very specific. Why keep the reserve untouched? I asked. Victor gave a quiet sigh. Because it makes the company more attractive to buyers. That made sense. A large reserve meant stability, security, higher sale value. Daniel wasn't just selling the company. He was preparing it to look perfect. And that meant the buyers would pay far more than the company's normal valuation. Suddenly, the timeline became clear. House sold. Mother removed. The company sale has been finalized. Daniel would walk away with millions, and no one would question anything, unless someone stopped him. Victor studied my face. Mrs. Hale, what would you like to do? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked out the small window beside the bed. The nursing home parking lot stretched quietly beyond the glass. A few residents walked slowly along the sidewalk. Life is continuing as usual, but nothing about my life felt usual anymore. My son believes I'm powerless, I said finally. Victor nodded. That appears to be his assumption. Good. Victor raised an eyebrow. Good. Yes. Because if Daniel believed I was powerless, he would never see what was coming. I turned back toward Victor. How soon can we stop the sale? Victor thought for a moment. The simplest method would be to challenge Daniel's authority as owner. How? By presenting the share transfer documents. That would stop the sale? Immediately. I considered the idea carefully. It would certainly work. But it would also warn Daniel. And something inside me didn't want to warn him. Not yet. No, I said slowly. Victor frowned slightly. You don't want to stop the sale? Oh, I do. Then why wait? Because Daniel had taken something from me that could never be replaced. My home. My trust. My dignity. And part of me believed he needed to feel exactly how fragile his success truly was. I want to see what he does next, I said quietly. Victor studied me for several seconds. Then to my surprise he smiled. Your husband once said something very interesting about you. What was that? That people often underestimate Margaret Hale. I allowed myself a small smile. Richard was usually right. Victor stood and closed his briefcase. Very well. I'll continue gathering information. When is the sale meeting scheduled? 2 weeks from Friday. 2 weeks. That was more than enough time. Victor paused at the door. There's one more thing. What is it? Your son will likely visit soon. Why? Because the buyers will want confirmation that the family supports the transaction. Meaning Daniel would come here. To the nursing home. To make sure I stayed quiet. The thought almost made me laugh. After Victor left, I sat by the window for a long time, watching the afternoon light fade across the parking lot. Daniel believed this story had already ended. But in truth, it was only the beginning. And in less than 2 weeks, my son was going to learn something he should have checked a long time ago. Who really owned the company he was about to sell? The first sign that something was wrong came 3 days later. Daniel rarely visited the nursing home. In fact, since leaving me there, he had only come once. But that morning, just after breakfast, a nurse knocked gently on my door. Mrs. Hale, she said. Your son is here to see you. I folded the newspaper on my lap and looked toward the window. Right on schedule. Victor had predicted it. When someone is about to close a deal worth millions of dollars, they like to eliminate every possible risk. And in Daniel's mind, I was the last loose end. Thank you, I told the nurse. I'll meet him in the lounge. The lounge was a quiet room near the front entrance of Green Meadows. A few elderly residents sat in armchairs watching television while sunlight filtered through the tall windows. Daniel stood near the doorway, perfectly dressed as always. Gray suit, polished shoes, a confident smile. The same smile he had worn the day he left me here. When he saw me, he opened his arms slightly as if greeting an old friend. Mom, he said warmly. You look good. I stopped a few feet away from him. Do I? Yes. This place seems to be treating you well. I glanced around the room. The faded carpet, the quiet television, the faint smell of disinfectant. Yes, I said calmly. It's comfortable. Daniel relaxed slightly. He had expected bitterness, anger. Instead, he found something else. Calm. That always made him uncomfortable. He gestured toward a small table near the window. Mind if we sit? We sat across from each other. For a moment he studied my face, as if trying to measure how much I understood about what had happened. So, he said finally, how are you adjusting? I'm learning. That's good. Daniel leaned back in his chair. You know, Mom, this really was the best decision. The house was too much work for you. I didn't argue. Instead, I asked a simple question. How much did you sell it for? The question caught him slightly off guard. But only for a moment. 480,000, he said. That number didn't surprise me. Property values on Willow Street had risen dramatically over the past decade. You did well, I said quietly. Daniel smiled. I always try to. For several seconds we sat in silence. Then Daniel reached into his leather briefcase. I actually came today because I need your help with something. Of course you did, I thought. He pulled out a thin folder. Legal documents. I just need one more signature, he said casually. What kind of signature? Nothing complicated. Just a confirmation regarding the company. My heart beat once slowly, then again. So this was it. The final step. Daniel slid the paper across the table. Just routine paperwork, he added. I picked up the document and read the title carefully. Shareholder Authorization Agreement. Interesting. Very interesting. Daniel watched my eyes move across the page. He was waiting, watching, trying to decide whether I understood what the document meant. But I had spent 30 years working in a bank. I understood contracts very well. This document would transfer temporary authority over all shareholder decisions to Daniel, including the authority to sell the company. In other words, if I signed this paper, Daniel would legally gain control over the shares my husband had secretly placed in my name. He had done his homework. He knew he needed my approval, but he believed I didn't know why. Just sign at the bottom, Daniel said lightly. I looked up at him. You're selling the company. It wasn't a question. Daniel froze. Just slightly, but enough for me to notice. Who told you that? He asked. I read the news sometimes. That wasn't entirely true, but it sounded believable. Daniel exhaled slowly. Well, yes. I'm negotiating a deal. Why? Because it's the smart move. Your father built that company from nothing, and I turned it into something bigger. His voice sharpened slightly. That's how business works. I studied him carefully. When is the sale meeting? Daniel hesitated. Then he answered. Next Friday. Exactly the date Victor had mentioned. The timeline was perfect. So you need this signed before then, I said. Daniel smiled again. Just to keep everything simple. Simple. That was an interesting word. Because nothing about this situation was simple. Daniel believed he was one signature away from completing his plan. But he didn't realize something important. I had already read the document twice, and I knew exactly what it would do. Mom, he said gently, you trust me, don't you? The question hung in the air between us. Once upon a time, the answer would have been immediate. Of course I trusted him. He was my son. But now, things were different. Yes, I said calmly. I trust you. Daniel relaxed. That was the answer he expected. Good, he said, sliding the pen across the table. Then let's take care of this. Picked up the pen. But instead of signing immediately, I studied the page once more. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Impatience flickered across his face. Mom, it's just a formality. I know. You don't need to read every line. I like to be thorough. He forced a small laugh. That's something you definitely got from Dad. Yes, I thought. It is. Finally, I placed the pen against the paper. My hand moved slowly across the page. Margaret Hale. The signature looked steady, deliberate. Daniel smiled broadly. Perfect. He quickly pulled the document back and placed it inside his briefcase. Just like that. He believed everything was finished. But Daniel had made one small mistake. While he was watching my signature, he hadn't noticed something else. The tiny handwritten note I added beside it. 3 words. Subject to verification. In legal language, that phrase changes everything. Daniel stood up. Well, that's done, he said cheerfully. Thank you, Mom. What happens next? I asked. The sales meeting is next Friday. And after that? Daniel closed his briefcase. After that, things will be very different. I believed him. They certainly would be. He walked toward the door, then paused. Oh, one more thing. Yes. After the deal closes, I might move to California for a while. New opportunities. California. Of course. Daniel wasn't planning to stay nearby. He was planning to disappear. Well, I said softly, I hope everything works out the way you expect. Daniel smiled. It will. Then he left the room. I watched the front door close behind him, and for a moment the lounge was completely silent. An elderly man coughed softly across the room. The television murmured. Life continued as usual. But something had changed, because Daniel believed he had won, and in exactly 7 days, he was going to discover just how wrong he was. The morning of the sale meeting arrived quietly. For Daniel, it was probably the most important day of his career. For me, it was the day my son was finally going to understand the difference between confidence and control. At 9 o'clock that morning, Victor Langford arrived at Green Meadows. He stood in the doorway of my room holding a garment bag. "You're ready?" he asked. I nodded. Inside the bag was a navy blue suit I hadn't worn in years. Victor had brought it 2 days earlier after explaining something very important. "Appearances matter," he had said. "Especially in business. Especially in rooms where people assume they already know who holds the power." When I stepped into the hallway 20 minutes later, several nurses looked at me with surprise. The quiet woman from room 214 suddenly looked very different. Victor studied me carefully. "Perfect," he said. "You don't look like someone who lives in a nursing home." "Good," I replied calmly. "Because today I don't intend to behave like someone who does." The drive into the city took 30 minutes. Rain clouds hung low over the buildings, and traffic moved slowly through the morning streets. Neither of us spoke much during the drive. We didn't need to. Everything had already been prepared. The documents, the filings, the legal notices. Daniel believed the meeting would be simple. A final handshake, a signature, a transfer of millions of dollars. But there was one detail he had overlooked. And that detail was sitting quietly in the passenger seat beside Victor Langford. Me. The conference room was on the 12th floor of a modern glass building downtown. Victor led me through the lobby and into an elevator filled with professionals holding briefcases and coffee cups. No one paid attention to the elderly woman standing quietly near the back wall. That was fine. People rarely notice what they aren't expecting. When the elevator doors opened, Victor guided me down a long hallway toward a conference room with large glass walls. Inside, several men in dark suits sat around a polished table reviewing documents. And at the head of the table, Daniel. My son looked confident, relaxed. He was speaking with 2 representatives from the Seattle Development Group who were purchasing the company. I paused outside the doorway. Victor leaned toward me. "Once we enter the room, everything will move quickly." "I understand. Are you certain you want to handle this personally?" "Yes." Victor gave a small nod. "Then let's begin." He pushed open the door. The conversation inside stopped immediately. 8 people turned to look at us. Daniel's expression changed first. Confusion. Then disbelief. Then something sharper. "Mom." The word sounded almost ridiculous in the quiet room. "Hello, Daniel," I said calmly. No one moved. One of the buyers glanced between us. "Is this a family matter?" Victor stepped forward. "My name is Victor Langford, legal counsel for Mrs. Margaret Hale." That statement alone caused several eyebrows to rise. Daniel stood slowly. "What is this?" he demanded. Victor placed a folder on the table. "This meeting cannot proceed as currently planned." The lead buyer frowned. "I'm sorry, but we've spent months negotiating this acquisition." Victor opened the folder. "Yes, I'm aware. However, there is a significant legal issue regarding the ownership of Hale Construction." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Victor," he said sharply, "you have no authority here." Victor didn't respond. Instead, he slid a document across the table. Shareholder transfer certificate, the original one, signed by Richard Hale 8 years earlier. The buyer picked it up and began reading. 30 seconds passed. Then his expression changed. He looked at Daniel. "Daniel, what exactly is this?" Daniel's voice hardened. "It's irrelevant." "No," the buyer replied quietly. "It's very relevant." He turned the document around so everyone at the table could see. According to this, Margaret Hale owned 60% of the company. The room fell silent. Daniel laughed. A short, dismissive laugh. "That document is outdated." Victor calmly placed 3 additional documents on the table. Corporate filings, ownership records, updated legal registrations. All verified, Victor said. The second buyer leaned forward. You're saying Daniel doesn't actually own the company? Victor shook his head. Mr. Hale is the acting manager, but the majority shareholder. He turned slightly toward me. Is Mrs. Margaret Hale? Every eye in the room moved in my direction. Daniel's face had gone pale. This is ridiculous, he snapped. Mom, tell them this is a misunderstanding. I met his gaze calmly. Is it? You signed the authorization. Yes, I said. I did. Daniel turned toward the buyers. See? She confirmed it herself. Victor raised a hand. Actually, that signature included a legal condition. He slid the authorization form onto the table. One of the buyers read it carefully. Then his eyebrows lifted. Subject to verification. He looked up slowly. What does that mean? Victor answered calmly. It means the authorization only applies if the signer verifies the transaction. And she hasn't? No. Daniel stared at the paper. Realization began spreading across his face. You set me up, he whispered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I simply spoke the truth. Daniel, I said quietly, you sold my house. You tricked me. No. You signed the documents. Yes. And now you're pretending you didn't know? Victor interrupted calmly. Mr. Hale, regardless of personal disagreements, the legal facts are clear. He tapped the share certificate. The majority owner of Hale Construction has not approved this sale. The lead buyer leaned back in his chair. In that case, he closed the folder slowly. This transaction cannot proceed. Daniel's voice exploded. You can't just walk away. Yes, the buyer replied calmly. We can. He stood. So can everyone else in this room. One by one, the representatives began gathering their papers. Chairs scraped quietly against the floor. Daniel looked around in disbelief. Wait. But the deal was already dead. The lead buyer paused near the door. For what it's worth, he said. You should have verified your ownership before negotiating the sale. Then he left. The others followed. Within seconds, the large conference room was almost empty. Only 4 people remained. Victor, Daniel, myself, and Daniel's lawyer. Daniel stared at me as if seeing a stranger. You planned this? No, I replied calmly. Your father did. Victor placed the final document on the table. The company belongs to Mrs. Hale. Daniel sank slowly into his chair. For the first time in his life, my son looked small. And the most important part? The consequences were only beginning. When the last buyer walked out of the conference room, the silence felt heavier than anything that had happened before. For months, Daniel had been building toward that moment. Negotiations, presentations, promises. And in less than 5 minutes it was gone. The room now held only 4 people. Victor Langford stood calmly beside the table. Daniel's lawyer sat stiffly in his chair, clearly unsure what to say next. Daniel himself hadn't moved. He stared at the empty doorway where the buyers had just disappeared, as if waiting for someone to come back and tell him the entire thing had been a mistake. No one did. Finally, he looked at me. You ruined everything, he said. His voice was quieter now. Not angry. Not confident. Just tired. I studied his face for a moment. For the first time that day, I allowed myself to really look at him. This was the boy I had raised. The boy who once cried when he scraped his knee on the sidewalk. The boy who used to sit beside his father in the workshop, holding nails while Richard built cabinets for the kitchen. But somewhere along the way, that boy had disappeared. Daniel, I said gently, you ruined it yourself. He shook his head. You don't understand. No, I replied. I understand perfectly. Victor quietly gathered the documents from the table while Daniel's lawyer finally spoke. Mrs. Hale, he said carefully, perhaps we should discuss this privately. There's nothing to discuss. Daniel leaned forward suddenly. You're not actually going to take the company from me. The desperation in his voice was impossible to miss. You can't run it. I don't need to. You'll destroy everything Dad built. At that, something inside me hardened. Your father trusted you to run the company, I said. He did not trust you to own it. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. So he planned this? Yes. Why? The question hung between us. Why? That was the same question I had asked Victor in the garden. And now, looking at Daniel, the answer seemed painfully obvious. Because he knew you, I said quietly. Daniel looked away. For several seconds no one spoke. Then Victor closed his briefcase. Mrs. Hale, he said softly, we should probably leave. I nodded. But before I turned toward the door, Daniel spoke again. What happens now? I paused. That depends on you. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? You forged my signature on property documents. His lawyer immediately stiffened. Allegedly, he corrected quickly. I ignored him. You transferred my house without my consent. Daniel's face went pale. You put me in a nursing home. I let the words sit in the room for a moment. Then I added quietly. You made your choices. Daniel's voice dropped. So what are you going to do? The answer surprised even me. Nothing. Both Daniel and his lawyer blinked. Nothing. Daniel repeated. Yes. You're just walking away? No. I met his eyes steadily. I'm moving forward. Victor and I left the building without another word. Outside, the rain had stopped. The streets glistened under a pale afternoon sky. For the first time in weeks, I felt the strange sensation of breathing freely. Victor opened the car door for me. Well, he said as we drove away, that went better than expected. I smiled slightly. Yes. But the real decision is still ahead. Victor nodded. What will you do with the company? That question stayed with me for several days. Back at Green Meadows, the nurses greeted me warmly. The same quiet room waited for me. But everything felt different now. Because the situation had changed. The company was mine. Legally. Completely. And that meant I had the power to decide its future. 3 days later I called Victor. I've made a decision, I told him. What kind? I want to sell the company. Victor was silent for a moment. Are you certain? Yes. Why? I looked out the window of my room. A group of residents sat in the garden laughing softly in the afternoon sun. Because my husband spent 40 years building that company, I said. And I don't want its future to be tied to the mistakes of my son. Victor exhaled slowly. That's a very large decision. I know. Have you considered who might buy it? Yes. 2 weeks later, we met with the same Seattle development group Daniel had tried to sell to. But this time the meeting was very different. They knew exactly who owned the company. They knew exactly who they were negotiating with. And the offer they made reflected that. $42 million. Victor reviewed the documents carefully. Everything was clear. Everything was fair. When I signed the final agreement, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Not revenge. Closure. The following month I left Green Meadows. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Simply quietly. Victor helped me purchase a small house on the edge of the city. It wasn't large. But it had a garden. And a wide front porch. And most importantly, it belonged to me. The first morning I woke up there. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows while birds moved through the trees outside. I made coffee and stepped onto the porch. For a long time I simply sat there, listening to the quiet sounds of a life that was finally my own again. Daniel called once. Only once. I'm sorry, he said. I listened. Then I answered honestly. I hope you learn from this. The call ended shortly afterward. We haven't spoken since. And that's all right. Because some life lessons arrive late. But they arrive exactly when they're needed. My husband once told me something I didn't fully understand at the time. Margaret, he said. People reveal who they really are when they believe they have power. He was right. Daniel believed he had power. Until the moment he discovered he didn't. As for me, I lost my house. My comfort. And for a while even my dignity. But in the end I gained something far more valuable. Freedom. And at 74 years old, that turned out to be worth everything. If this story meant something to you, please share your thoughts in the comments. And tell me honestly, what would you have done in my place?